Good morning and welcome to Lifespan's Living Your Best Life, Aging Well with Resilience webinar series. My name is Stephen Matsey and I'm your host for today's presentation. Lifespan is a professional aging care provider specializing in geriatric care management, home care, and well-being services, which enable older adults to live their best life every day of their life. I would like to first take this opportunity to thank each of you for joining us today and spending some time as we learn more about LGBT aging. Living Your Best Life, Aging Well with Resilience webinar series. My name is Stephen Matsey, and I'm your host for today's presentation. Lifespan is having a technical difficulty, folks. Bear with me just a moment. Management, home care, and well-being services, which enable older adults to live their best life every day. I would like to first take this opportunity to thank each of you for joining us today and spending some time as we learn more about it. Sorry about that, folks. I fixed the issue. Thank you for your patience. So again, I want to thank each of you for joining us this morning for our well-being, our Living Your Best Life webinar. I'd also like to thank our Lifespan Zoom guru, James Duesenberg of TAP Production, who is busy behind the scenes running the show. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with each of you after today's event. Your videos are turned off and your mics are muted. However, the chat function is available if a concern comes up during the presentation. We will do our best to monitor this, but please try to write down any questions you might have, as we will have time to answer those after today's presentation. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so I ask that you use that when the time is appropriate. June is Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Pride Month. And in honor of this, Lifespan felt it was imperative to bring awareness to the unique challenges and needs of our community's LGBT older adults. And today's presenter, Jane Swickerath, is the perfect person to do this. And I am grateful and proud to introduce her. Jane received her master's degree in social work from San Jose State University. She also serves on the board of directors for the Seniors Council and has for the past 10 years representing LGBT older adults. Jane also spent much of her social work career as the 60-plus senior program coordinator at the Diversity Center of Santa Cruz County, which addresses the needs and provides support for Santa Cruz LGBT older adults. In addition, she conducts LGBT aging sensitivity trainings for community agencies and local residential care and skilled nursing facilities. You know, as COVID-19 took its hold on our world, Jane pivoted to create a digital training to continue advocating for LGBT older adults living in long-term care facilities. I and Santa Cruz are grateful to have Jane as our very own LGBT aging expert. So please help me bring a warm virtual welcome to my mentor and dear friend, Jane Swickerath. Jane, you can start coming in and sharing your screen.
Technology. Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone, and welcome, and happy Pride. And thank you for your interest in the subject of this webinar today. I also want to thank Stephen Matsey and Lifespan for their opportunity to allow me to present, and James Duesenberg with TAP Productions, who is my tech support as well as theirs. My name is Jane Swickerath again, and this webinar is intended to expand your understanding of the history and the challenges that today's LGBT seniors face. LGBT represents lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and I'll use LGBT throughout the webinar. Let's get started. Uh-oh. There we go. 10% of the population is LGBT. We're your family, your friends, your coworkers, and your neighbors. I am having trouble with technology. James, let's see if we can do this. Okay, I want to start with your personal and professional attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity. How do you currently feel about working with LGBT older adults? Can you trace the root of your attitudes? How often and recent have you encountered challenging attitudes? And the last question is really important to me. How would you prefer to feel when working with LGBT older adults? Remember that today's older adults have been shaped by huge historical events, financial crises, wars, civil changes like the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, Chicano civil rights, Asian American civil rights, and the gay liberation movements. All changes outside of ourselves, but changes that affect the way this generation feels, how they think, and what they believe. I hope today you'll understand how very different the history of the LGBT seniors experience has been compared to a generalized understanding of heterosexual seniors, how their history affects their aging. Today's presentation is going to cover understanding terminology and definitions, challenges facing LGBT elders, focusing on history, finance, and social support. LGBT history, we'll talk about some of the health disparities, some transgender issues, and end with what you can do to make your agency or business more welcoming to LGBT elders. LGBT terminology are sexual orientation and gender identity, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and the current term for bisexual is now pansexual. Transgender, and many of the youth are using the term gender fluid, intersex, and questioning. And I always like to say, please don't ever use the term queer when discussing LGBT issues with older adults. When we look at the definitions, we want to talk about the terms of respect, how we each identify. Sexual orientation is considered the romantic, emotional, physical, and sexual attraction to another human being. We self-identify as homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. Gender identity. California Civil Code Section 51 states that the individual's stated gender identity must be acknowledged and respected. Gender expression, how we dress, how we wear our hair, accessorize. Transgender, when there's a difference between how the transgender individual expresses their gender and what would typically be used as their gender on birth record. LGBT seniors are invisible in society today, but no more so than the heterosexual seniors. Today, we'll be focusing on the unmet needs of LGBT seniors. Today, the numbers change, but between 2.4 and 3.5 million LGBT older adults over the age of 50 in the United States. We think 5 million by 2030, and that's coming soon. In Santa Cruz County, the latest estimate is about 6,600. However, the Diversity Center Senior Program is only connected to 400. With age come many of the challenges facing LGBT older adults. They've never perhaps entered the world of service and service providers who are often untrained in LGBT age and cultural sensitivity. And so the service agencies are seen as unwelcoming to this population. There are large immigrant workforce populations with preconceived cultural expectations. They need to understand the history of the LGBT and treat everyone with dignity and respect. Ageism is a huge problem for all seniors. We're also aware of it in the LGBT community. And our LGBT seniors are more likely to be in need of frequent healthcare, financial assistance, and social support, which will be explained soon. A practical guide to collecting data. New laws require that data collection be on the paperwork for senior social service agencies. Government and private foundation funding you have to show them you have a need for funding. And so the data-driven questions require sensitivity on the part of the service provider and trust on the part of the person in need. However, look at these statements made during initial data collection training. Some thought they didn't have any LGBT older adults. Some thought they could identify LGBT. The next one, why do I need to ask about both sexual orientation and gender identity? I'd say that's probably a very confusing set of terms, and a lot of people don't understand the difference. And the last one, we treat everyone as equals, so we don't need to ask. If you are working in the service providing world, please be aware that the data collection is really important to future funding for programs. AARP has a large LGBT section, and one of their healthy aging resources asks what 3 key elements for successful aging are necessary. And what we find is that health and healthcare, including your doctors and your relationship with all your health coworkers, financial security, and social and community support. So I ask you to think about your grandparents, your parents, or yourself. As we're moving towards our latter years, are we prepared? And I think you'll see that for the LGBT elders, they have a very different experience. Healthcare challenges. In the LGBT community, they have had past experiences with discrimination in healthcare environments. Doctors, nurses, physical therapists are rarely trained in LGBT issues. Medical schools do not offer many courses or cover the topic. And so often physical and mental disparities are overlooked or ignored. Healthcare environments, hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmacies are often considered inhospitable to LGBT elders. Long-term care facilities often fail to protect LGBT elders. The exciting news is that 2 years ago, SB 219 was passed and signed into law in the state of California. It is literally the LGBT Bill of Rights in long-term care facilities. And visitation policies and medical decision-making laws often exclude families of choice. Understand that families of choice is a term that we use in our community when our relationships with our birth families have dissolved and we need a tight support system that can be made up of partners, friends, neighbors, community members that do what they can, but often without being seen as legitimate family members. And the residents' rights and LGBT community is on the last side. That's from Lambda Legal, and I'd invite you to look that up. Every LGBT senior that's in long-term care should know what their rights are. Who will be there to help us? I think we all expect to age with a partner or children that will care for us, but many in the LGBT community who have lost their partners are alone at this time in their life. Physical and mental disparities. Let's start with the barriers. Again, delayed and avoiding healthcare because of past experiences within healthcare environments have a huge effect on LGBT aging. Up to 48%, it was recently revealed, still conceal their sexual orientation from their doctor. And there is a distrust in medical professionals that reduces our health and our care as we age. LGBT have worse physical and mental health, higher rates of disability, higher rates of disease, and higher rates of physical limitation. For the LGBT in their youth, they were often involved in riskier behavior, drinking, smoking, risky health behavior that challenges their healthcare as they age. Transgender older adults we know have the highest level of isolation and suicide ideation. Our HIV positive older adults have the worst overall physical and mental health. And one study found that LGBT older adults of color with lower education and lower income lead to elevated risks for health disparities. Health and healthcare. I put a couple slides up here. Lesbian and bisexual women, you'll see that heart disease is there in several of the studies. So now long-term care facilities have to train staff in CPR and make sure that they're updated. And this became specifically for our LGBT elders in care. 50% of transgender older adults have been struggling with obesity. Transgender health issues complicated by hormone therapy. Most of that was purchased on the black market and not tested nor under medical supervision. I wanted to put a couple of the surveys up here today. The MetLife, it's an older survey, but even at that time, less than 20% felt that they'd be treated with dignity and respect by medical personnel. The Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, 40% of nursing students found that LGBT people should keep their sexuality private, and between 5 and 12% found them disgusting. This is when I like to ask if you check negative attitudes in your hiring process. Ask some questions before you hire to make sure that you're not going to have problems later on. And as many as 15% of older adults report having been refused health care or have received inadequate care based on who they are. So the second factor in the 3 factors of aging well is our financial security. Safety net programs were created and laws intended to support our older Americans. In 1935, President Roosevelt signed in the Social Security Act. It was never intended to support retirees, but to add that safety net. However, most of us look forward to that monthly check to support us after our working years have stopped. However, for LGBT elders, a lifetime of employment discrimination has led to financial insecurity. When they were younger, LGBT it used to mean being hired and taking any job you could get, keeping it as long as you could hide who you were, and moving on as quickly as someone discovered. Many LGBT worked low-paying jobs throughout their life, and in the end, they end up with lower incomes, limited job opportunities, earning disparities, lifelong earnings, smaller pensions, smaller Social Security, all leading to financial insecurity. 42% have less than $10,000 in savings today. When we fall in love, we think, well, as we age, we'll have someone to care for us and someone that we'll take care of. But for our older LGBT who have survived the loss of a partner, they are often alone without social support near the end. So who are our social support networks? 20% in a New York study had no one to call for support in a crisis. That's 10% higher than the general senior population. We are twice as likely to live alone as our heterosexual elders, half as likely to have life partners or significant others. Many have outlived their partners and are now alone when they need assistance the most. We're half as likely to have no close relatives to call for help. So many LGBT moved far away from home when they were younger to hide who they were, or when they came out to their families, they were rejected and moved away. Many have not seen any family members for decades. We are 4 times less likely to have children to call for help. However, many LGBT married when they were younger, had children, then discovered who they were, and many of their children and family members have turned their backs on them. 51% say they do not have adequate support system to assist them as they age. Often we think our seniors should just get out and join groups and reduce social isolation. But the largest obstacle for social support and community engagement is that most LGBT elders feel unwelcome in mainstream aging programs, in religious communities, LGBT community, in volunteer opportunities, and in senior housing. So I want you to think about what's the first question anybody asks when they meet somebody new. It's, is your wife here? Is your husband here? Do you have children? For an LGBT senior going into a senior center for a congregate meal, they have to decide, are they going to lie or are they going to live their truth and be authentic? In religious communities, the same way. I was talking to somebody who volunteers at Gray Bears and how fearful they were about being able to identify as an LGBT elder and would they be rejected if they came out. So feeling unwelcome is something that we all have to work towards making a more welcoming community. I want to talk about internal stigma. So for most people living in a marginalized population, the feeling is that without adequate cultural support, you can develop feelings of internalized stigma. Many LGBT people have never lived openly as gay. Growing up in a society that hated and rejected them, they have hidden most of their lives for safety. Minority stress is developed within those marginalized communities, often with victimization. And with victimization and a history of it come expectations of rejection. We don't put ourselves out because we assume that we'll be rejected, and saving the pain by staying isolated deepens in our later years. Recloseting and concealment, while it might be a coping mechanism, the really frightening part to me is that 98% of the LGBT seniors feel they need to recloset as soon as they go into hospitals or any long-term care facility where someone's going to need to care for them. Social isolation is about surviving for this generation. External problems facing LGBT elders: homophobia, the critical and hostile behavior towards others that we use to discriminate. Heterosexism, attitudes of superiority and privilege, the hierarchical structure that puts heterosexuals above homosexuals, relegating them to a second-class citizen status. Institutional discriminations, we're hearing a lot about that with Black Lives Matter. But we're talking about the laws, the hiring practice, promotion practices, where the dominant culture is rewarded and minority cultures are often subjected to discrimination. Worker intolerance and condemnation. Bullying. I always ask, we put so much attention lately on bullying in schools, but little bullies grow up to be the bully in your office when you're working, or the bully in a senior housing complex. Does your agency or business have a bullying policy? And if so, it should be zero tolerance with consequences connected to the behavior. In skilled nursing facilities, I say that if a resident is seen bullying another resident, they need to be removed from that situation, serve their meals in their room, and not allowed back into community setting until they can correct their behavior. There should be zero tolerance. And discrimination at senior social service agencies is a huge external problem because LGBT seniors are considered the most underutilized minority population in America today. To understand LGBT seniors, you must first understand their history. So I'm going to go through a brief history. In the 1930s and 40s, it was both considered illegal and immoral, and parents could put a young adult child against their will into jail or a psychiatric asylum. Psychological diagnoses led to abuses. Lobotomies, shock treatments, and castrations were used to cure them. During the World War II, it was the first time that many youth went into the military or into the major cities to do factory war work. And this is when they found that they weren't alone, that there were others like them, that they could be loved and they could love others. It was also the first time they understood that there was a language about who they were. After World War II, during the 1950s, was the McCarthyism scare and the anti-communism phase. A lot of fear if you were different at all. And it was a time of the first gay and lesbian forming hushed social organizations to connect with each other. In 1953, Eisenhower signed the Executive Order 10450, barring LGBT from federal employment. 5,000 were fired in the Lavender Scare. In California, anti-vagrancy laws were used for antisocial behavior. If gay men and women were seen out cross-dressing, they would be picked up and thrown in jail. Women would be thrown in jail for wearing pants. Police raids on gay bars and private residences shattered any feeling of security. If you were going to throw a party and inviting friends, you always had to invite the same number of gay men as you did lesbians. So if there was a knock on the door and the threat of a raid, you could switch partners and attempt to look like a heterosexual gathering. In 1969, the police raid of Stonewall Inn Bar in New York City marked the first time gay patrons fought back from police brutality. It is considered the turning point in the gay liberation movement. In 1973, the American Psychological Association declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. And the gay liberation movement of the 1970s followed the civil rights, women's liberation, Chicano civil rights, Asian American movements, modeling each movement on the other's successes. The bar scene, unfortunately, was where we were allowed to gather, socialize, connect, but with it came higher rates of drinking, smoking. And the gay pride flag, created in 1978 by James Baker in San Francisco, represents our community's pride, and the colors represent the diversity within our community. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic hit. I don't know if you heard President Biden and his wife Jill yesterday do their pride announcement, but Jill mentioned it had been 40 years since the AIDS epidemic, and yet we still don't have a vaccine for that. We had tremendous loss, death, grieving, changes in our demographics and social policies. I have a friend who lost 90 people he loved within 1 year of the AIDS epidemic. Recloseting with age, loss of support, and an increased need for assistance all increases the risk for safety. Policy changes started in state, city, counties, and federal for protection against discrimination for all LGBT in employment, housing, and long-term care facilities. California leads the nation in anti-discrimination or non-discrimination laws. In June of 2015, the US Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. 543,000 same-sex marriage couple households are in America today. This slide represents some of the discrimination and abuse. The research study on this one says that gay males are abused at a higher rate than lesbians, that violence is connected to visibility, and that the higher the income, the lower the violence. But when you look at this and you think of your grandparents and your parents, have they ever walked out of their house and had to prepare themselves for an assault? Because an LGBT senior may only feel safe in their home and every day on some level get ready for what might come. By the way, on that last slide, There's a great exercise on the very last slide called How Comfortable Am I? That looks at our biases. And I would encourage all of you who are interested in that to email me and I'll shoot you back that exercise called How Comfortable Am I? Many of you may not know a transgender man or a woman, so we hope that the information in the next couple of slides will give you at least a better understanding of their challenges. They are considered the most discriminated against in our society today and the most isolated. Transgenders are often estranged from birth family members. If they were married before they transitioned, they had to redefine their relationships, often ending in divorce, but sometimes the marriages lasted with loving couples. There is a heavy reliance on partners and friends so that you can stay out of skilled nursing facilities and assisted living. End of life review is interesting for them because the look back is almost 2 life reviews. The first part of their life, maybe when they were married and have children, and then they need another life review for when they transitioned in the later years. There are often issues with disclosure and again, incredible isolation for the transgender elders and challenges with gender mismatch on death certificates. I want to talk a little bit about transgender care in long-term care facilities because here is when they are the most vulnerable. Hiding is not an option. Most transgender elders have not had reassignment surgery, even if they have dressed in the preferred gender for many, many years. Shared room replacement is still a problem. I'm asked this one a lot, but SB 219 makes it very clear that during intake, if an individual identifies as female, they must be placed in a room with another woman. Personal care by aides, horrific stories across the United States of aides not being willing to feed residents if they think they're gay, of not being willing to bathe them or give them their medication. Resident transgender children are treated badly by staff in facilities. And in the SFF is Stories from the Field, one of the first surveys on LGBT care in long-term care facilities. 80 individuals reported that they had experienced refusal by staff to refer to the resident by his or her name or pronoun. If you don't know, ask. Do you prefer to be called he, she, they, them, him, her? And the anonymous ombudsman wrote, a resident who is transgender was preventing from eating with other residents, talking with them, or being involved in social and recreational activities. And yet it's not all bad. We have strengths and resources. Crisis competency is a term we use when during the coming out process, we develop a sense of self-esteem and self-acceptance. We have more gender role flexibility. When you don't expect the other gender to do some of the duties, you step up and learn how to do them yourself. Resilience, because when you've been knocked down, you learn how to get up quicker. We bounce back, and that's resiliency. Families of choice, as mentioned, the LGBT community ends up with clusters of caring, loving individuals, and they become our family of choice. Remember to always ask in the intakes if they have family of choice members they want listed as their contact member. Incredibly independent. The LGBT seniors that I know are independent above all else. And what the research has found is that for wealthier LGBT who have spent money on expensive legal preparation, they will try to remain as independent and out of all facilities as they age. They also have a sense of better health on surveys and better aging. We have the LGBT community oversight. Now remember, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was first working at the Diversity Center, I did a study, and at that time there were 189 LGBT community centers across the United States. but we were one of only 16 that had a senior program. Today, since the 2008 recession, a lot of the community centers have closed their doors. I believe that there are less than 120 now in existence, but closer to 80 have LGBT senior programs. And we have, again, California non-discrimination laws on the books. So we are protected at all ages in California. Our local support and resources, Advocacy Inc. runs both the Ombudsman program that researches and investigates any signs of abuse and discrimination in long-term care facilities. We also run the LGBT Aging Cultural Sensitivity Training, which you're participating in today. And this training is funded by both private donations from LGBT elders, as well as the Diversity Partnership at our local community foundation. We have our Diversity Center that has been in Santa Cruz for over 30 years and runs a senior program to help connect LGBT seniors, break the isolation, and give them a safe space once a month to come together. They've done a really great job during the pandemic, and all of the luncheons are now on Zoom, where 40 to 50 elders will come together for a Zoom meeting and have a wonderful speaker. A little bit about HIV positive clients. The 10 to 16% of the older population have the worst overall mental and physical health, the highest rates of disability, the highest levels of poverty. This was surprising to me that HIV-related dementia is often misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, and that HIV testing guidelines do not include adults over the age of 65. This is not surprising. I remember years ago learning that pharmaceutical companies don't test any new drugs on seniors because of the chronic conditions we are experiencing or the drugs that we're on. And even the current COVID-19 vaccine was only tested for efficacy on 18 to 45-year-olds. So elders are going to find out how all of these things affect them in the years to come. A little bit on older lesbian special issues. Lower income than gay male counterparts. Remember that in their history, they took a lot of low-paying jobs, worked from job to job, anything to try and remain secretive and safe. We're less likely to have adequate pensions and healthcare in old age, and much higher rates of financial insecurity. Older lesbians are less likely to be homeowners and have a higher risk for homelessness. And again, the higher rates of breast cancer, obesity, and heart disease. A little bit on death and dying. That first quote, LGBT families have an added difficulty as bereaved gay and lesbians will not often be given the same recognition and support as heterosexual widows and widowers. Many remain closeted, so no one knew that they had a partner for 40 years and that partner died. They won't be receiving the sympathy cards. Or if they knew family and friends and neighbors but didn't approve of it, you still won't receive the kind of support. Hospitals and professional staff often do not refer LGBT to hospice services. And if you do find yourself in a hospice group, a grief group, you need to think about whether or not the other members of the group will accept you as a member. And if closeted, they may avoid all support groups altogether. We do expect to have a partner as we age, and that person may not be there for us. I want to go over the do's and don'ts. This came from a group working with skilled nursing facility staff, but it's pertinent to most of us. Don't assume that every client or resident is heterosexual. Don't assume that everyone in your client's life knows about their sexual orientation. Do treat information as you would with any other personal or medical information. It's confidential. Do accept the client's life partner as you would a married spouse. Don't assume that because you're okay with who they are, that they should come out to you. They may not. Do ask your client, especially on intakes, who the contact person should be. And you may consider, if you've got a family member who's maybe trying to work their way back into your life and you don't want them to have any access, you might put them down as someone not to contact. Don't assume that if the person isn't married, that they're gay or lesbian. Do be aware that the client has faced discrimination. Do talk to your supervisor if you feel uncomfortable working with a homosexual. They may assign you a different client. They may assign you some work so that you can work through your issues. And do discuss your concerns with coworkers if what you see is they're not treating their client well and giving inadequate assistance. The flag represents our pride. It's a symbol and it unites us. So creating an atmosphere of dignity and respect, we ask you to find a rainbow flag and place it in your workspace, or wear a rainbow pin to show your acceptance and support. Communicate confidentiality and maintain privacy. This includes when you go into the lunchroom and you're chatting with your coworkers. It is against the law to discuss issues about your clients, particularly your LGBT clients. Don't assume gender identity. Ask, again, what gender pronoun would you prefer? He, she, or the new, they, them. Use inclusive language. If you put out a newsletter, if you're communicating with a large group, remember to be inclusive by saying partner or married same-sex couple, companion. Use national and local LGBT organizations for support. On the last slide, I've listed the National Resource Center for LGBT Aging. It is the first and only national resource center. It was funded by Congress in 2010 with $3 million. And SAGE from New York is running the center. That stands for the Services and Advocacy for Gay Elders. And assess your personal attitudes to work towards a more positive understanding of LGBT elders today. I always add, please register to vote, pay attention to any aging issues on the ballot, and remember to get out there and vote. AARP maintains a dignity report, and what they found was that any action that intentionally affirms LGBT adults by your program and facility can improve the quality of care. We know that LGBT are more comfortable knowing that their providers were trained, seeing more LGBT advertising. That would be a picture of two older women looking lovingly into each other's eyes, something along that line, or seeing LGBT staff. And let me remind the LGBT staff in long-term care facilities, staff is also protected by SB 219. And seeing LGBT signs and symbols gives a much more comfortable experience. Tomorrow's challenges: every day in the US, 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65. Soon there will be more citizens over 65 than under the age of 15 for the first time in US history. Remember when they used to show the pyramid of huge numbers of youth and coming up to a very small senior population to support and care for them? Today that pyramid is completely turned around. We have a smaller, younger population and a huge older population needing care. Today, 1,000 Californians turn 65 every day for the next 10 years. It's interesting when you think about statistics in California between 2011 and 2019. In 8 years, California's elder population grew by 34%. Youth under the age of 9 grew by 0.4. So when I hear about services needed in California, we need more services for our older adults. Remember that the baby boomers are here, they're coming, and they're going to demand a lot more from society. Get ready. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the law. I want to thank you so much for your attention during this webinar. And now we'll go to the last slide. And my email is on the top. There's the Resource Center for LGBT Aging's website. How comfortable am I is the bias exercise I mentioned. Honestly, that is a tremendous tool that you can use in the privacy of your home and really check out how you feel about different people. And the residents' rights in the LGBT community is from Lambda Legal, and that's their website. So at this point in time, I'll turn it back over to Stephen and we'll go to Q&A.
Terrific, Jane. Thank you so much. As James gets me back on screen, let's keep that final slide up for folks in the audience. They can write down those website addresses, and we'll take some Q&A here in just a moment. Again, Jane, amazing. I appreciate your awareness and bringing that to all of us that are here attending today. And you had a great slide on what we can do as a community of people, be it in the service industry or an ally or wanting to know more how we better support LGBT older adults and what you should do. Do you have any other comments on what, say, I could do to ensure that I am supporting our LGBT older population other than the do's and don'ts that you put up there?
You do it. You do it automatically, Stephen. It's a part of your fiber.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would say that when the LGBT Community Center, the Diversity Center is open, they usually have all sorts of pins and flags and coffee mugs with the Pride flag on it. So you might, if you're looking for something and you don't want to go online and you want to support our local community center, it's a great place to see if you can pick up some of those items.
Great, thank you. We have some Q&A coming in the Q&A. Remember, folks, down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Feel free to jump on that if you'd like to ask a question. This is more of another supportive comment. Thank you, Vicki Maxon, who is the current 60-plus senior program coordinator at the Diversity Center. She did an amazing job pivoting during the pandemic to ensure our community's LGBT older adults remained connected. So great job, Vicki. She has this to share for anybody that is wanting to be more supportive. To ensure that on your Zoom screen or on your name tag, list your pronouns. For example, I identify as he, him. That makes it easier for people if they, if you want to be mindful of misgendering them. We do have a question from John Carroll out there who's thanking you so much for the great presentation. You mentioned, and this is from John, you mentioned that people shouldn't use the term queer around LGBT seniors. Can you say more about why that is?
It was, Stephen and I will disagree on this one, but I'm also 10 years older than he is. It was a derogatory term, spit and thrown at LGBT elders when they were younger. It is still very hurtful to them. But we have to remember that when we're talking about 60 plus and the years that follow, probably the 60 to 70-year-olds, some of them may be okay with hearing and using the term queer, but 70, 80, 90-year-olds, I would say don't take that chance of offending them. It's not necessary.
Thank you, Jane. And to clarify, yeah, I'm on the fence with the word queer. As a 57-year-old, almost 57-year-old individual, that term was used for me often growing up. So there's just some built-in internalized stigma that comes along with that. So just a point of clarification. Vicki also wanted to say, and hire Jane to give trainings. Absolutely agree, 100%. As I mentioned in my introduction, Jane is our local all things LGBT aging expert, in my humble opinion, and it's an honor to be a part of her trainings and learning from her. We have a question from Lucia. As a lesbian woman, I fear the time I end up in the only emergency room in Santa Cruz County, which is a Catholic-run healthcare hospital. That's a powerful comment, Lucia. Any words of encouragement, Jane, for any other LGBT individuals that might be on this call that have that same fear?
I think number one, we need to advocate for ourselves, and even before anything happens, make sure that you have someone in place to be your advocate and your support system so that they can oversee it. I will say that Dominican Hospital has a large number of LGBT staff, so they often are the ones that are overseeing care. It is a concern. It's literally how I became involved in LGBT aging research and doing the trainings, because 15, 20 years ago, no one else was doing it in our county. And at that time, I would have been scared going into Dominican Hospital. But today, I think if we have our advocates in place, the hospital themselves have had some training, although I'd like to do more there. And what can I say? Good luck, and don't put up with any shit.
Whoops.
Advocate for
Live
yourself.
streaming on YouTube. Hope they don't take that down. Just kidding.
James can edit that out.
Yeah, and Lucy, if I can offer my own personal opinion as an out gay man, gratefully I'm married to my husband. We've been together for 21 years, but I am not afraid anymore to tell them who I am. This is my capacity, and I know that's difficult, and I know that that's challenging, and I know it's full of fear. But I think the more that we bring our own selves forward as authentic individuals helps to reduce the potential issues that you might encounter. Just my observation, my opinion, because I want to get the best possible care that I can, and regardless of where I live. And my experience with Dominican has been positive. I do need to offer that as well. Philip asks, can you expand your explanation of families of choice?
Yeah. So when this generation, the older LGBT, were left home or rejected by their birth families, we felt the need to create social support systems, and that can be partners, ex-partners, friends, community members. The more you're involved, the more your support system can be strengthened. So that is what we consider our family of choice. For me, partner, best friends, people who I tell, okay, this is where my trust is, this is where I've put my hidden key, people that know me well, that know, of course, I share what my needs are. But we also live in a community that is almost a bubble of tolerance and liberal thought in Santa Cruz County. Most of the information on LGBT comes from nationwide resources and surveys. So some of them are, if you consider what it would be like to be an LGBT senior in a rural community in Iowa, it's going to be very different than going into a facility here in Santa Cruz. But our families of choice are the most important as we age.
Thank you.
I hope that explained it.
Thank you, Jane. And yeah, I'm just kind of piggybacking on that a little bit. Remember, our transgender older adults, really are higher risk for social isolation and discrimination in many different types of settings. And their families of choice are very, very important to them. On a personal note, on Friday, I'll be breaking bread with my family of choice. While I have a very accepting and loving family, which I'm grateful for biologically, they live out of the area. So I've created my husband and I have created our own little circle of support here in Santa Cruz to ensure that as we get older, we have that stability and social support built in, because I don't have any children. My cats, I love them, but they probably won't be able to care for me as I get older. All right, moving on, we have Erin, who thanks you very much, Jane, for your presentation and for being a pioneer and amazing example to follow. I could not have said that better myself. However, she would like to know what can she do when she has another administrator who is blatantly discriminated?
Wow, change really depends on top-down changes. Email me at the SCC, that's Santa Cruz County LGBT Project, and we can brainstorm on that and maybe get you some resources. It's really hard because most of the administrators and managers are older themselves, and some of them have grown up at the same time that our LGBT elders have. So they grew up with that idea that it was immoral, that it was illegal, that it was something that they could discriminate, a group they could discriminate against. But talk to me privately about where you work, and maybe we can find a solution.
Yeah, and
I will
remember,
tell you one thing. When we were talking about the religious communities, about 10 years ago at the Diversity Center, a group got together and surveyed about 50 different religious organizations, asking them, is your religious community open to LGBT, and various questions. The end result was that we tried to bridge with religious leaders who wanted their communities to be more welcoming with religious leaders who had experienced that and already developed techniques. And I hope that today we have enough religious communities that are welcoming to LGBT in Santa Cruz County.
great, thank you, Jane. Thank you. I'd also say, and just kind of go back to part of the presentation today, spoke of SB 219, which is for long-term care facilities. Jane, does that cover assisted living facilities, or is that just skilled nursing?
You know it does. Long-term care covers skilled nursing, assisted living, and board and cares. Any facility that accepts federal and state dollars has to abide by those laws. 98% of all skilled nursing facilities today in California accept federal and state tax dollars, and so they have to follow the SB 219 laws. And prior to that, it was using these stories from the field research that California legislatures put into place SB 1729. That now mandates that staff must be trained in long-term care facilities every 2 years. And all new staff has to receive LGBT aging sensitivity training within 6 months of hire. That's why we did put together the digital training and just finished putting those out to as many of the facilities as were interested.
Thank you, Jane. And yeah, Erin, we'll get you connected with Jane for a little bit more brainstorming on the back end. And Lucia said, thank you, Jane, for your, and thank you, Stephen. You're welcome, Lucia. Jan had a comment to say in response to treatment, and I'm reading this verbatim, in response to treatment at Dominican, there is no guarantee of how people will respond at the hospital, but I have to say my experience at Dominican was that while waiting for an update on my wife's care 8 years ago, a pink lady volunteer asked if I was a friend or family, and I responded, spouse. She blinked, but immediately pivoted and was totally respectful. So again, it's, I think there's power in acknowledging who we are to an individual, as their spouse, their partner, their family of choice.
We
And
live in paradise.
we do in many respects, but discrimination can still occur even in the most welcoming and affirming communities. That's why we need advocates like yourself, Jane. Thank you. And Philip has another, let me read this question. Do you advise people to complete and share with medical providers, hospital, assisted living facilities, family and friends, an advanced healthcare directive with a healthcare power of attorney to help them get the healthcare they want and to choose the person they want to be their healthcare decision maker if they cannot speak for themselves? So is that something you would advocate to that individual to do?
Absolutely. I think it's really important. And our local hospice has been very open about the 5 wishes or the California healthcare, what's it called? I just went blank.
The Advanced Healthcare Directive?
Advanced Healthcare Directive, thank you.
Wow.
And I think you should be out to every doctor. And if your doctor gives you any pushback, find a new doctor, physical therapists, everyone in our lives, we should be open and out to. The more we expose them to who we are, the more they're going to be ready to meet the next LGBT person that comes into their office.
Absolutely. And ask them before you add them as your primary care physician or mental health provider, what are your thoughts around LGBT issues? Hopefully there'll be an honest answer, and I suspect that they will. That's been my experience in choosing a PCP or going to any other healthcare facility here in Santa Cruz.
Mm-hmm. It's a partnership with our medical care providers. Yep. Absolutely.
And Philip wanted to add, prepare for your care, Advanced Healthcare Directive. And I'm going to copy this
good
link into the chat for everybody. If you want to just do a real quick click on it, that'll take you to that page for later viewing. So I don't send, Philip said that's the best one around. Great, thank you, Philip. And Philip is the new director at the Alzheimer's Association. I just want to acknowledge that real quickly. The Alzheimer's Association of Santa Cruz County does amazing things. The walk is coming up in September. If you've not joined a team, do that. A quick plug for Alzheimer's, Walk to End Alzheimer's coming up in September. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat bar. If there's any final ones, please feel free to jump in, or we can give you a little time back in your day. Any final questions? Got a great group of people here today, Jane, and I really appreciate everybody sticking around for the entire presentation, which, again, brought amazing awareness, not only in June as Pride Month, but every month. We should secure the well-being and livelihood of all individuals, all older adults, specifically paying more attention to those that are more marginalized, like our LGBTQ communities. So I want to say thank you again for attending today's webinar. Jane, again, virtual hugs to you. Thank you for you being here and being a part of my life. And we hope that you found today's presentation of value. And as a reminder, you will be receiving an email in a couple of days with the link. Please feel free to rewatch this, especially the do's and don'ts of providing service to LGBT older adults, and share it with a friend. The more people we bring awareness to in our community and our world, the safer our LGBT older adults are going to be as they continue to age. And another big thank you to you, Jane. Appreciate you, and to James for running the show. And let's see, that's all we got. Lifespan, thank you for hosting this amazing webinar. We look forward to seeing you in community. But until then, happy Pride Month to everyone here.
Happy Pride.